Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, over the last 50 years, Britain has become a richer place. But even in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, 1 in 5 of us is classed as living in poverty. But what does that really mean? And how should we define poverty? Ellie Price has been taking a look.
It's the sort of thing you might expect from the Victorians. A map of London, colour-coded by area, according to wealth or poverty.
The black colour was the how you define as worst colour back then, and that was described as semi-criminal and vicious. Although apparently vicious didn't mean that they'd attack you or they were particularly violent, it just meant that they were prone to vice. Right. So drinking, gambling, that kind of stuff.
The wealthy shipping magnate Charles Booth commissioned the maps in the late 1880s, updating them 10 years later.
They revised the information they found from the first edition by just accompanying bobbies on the beat, essentially. So
people that really knew the area.
Exactly, yeah. So again, more experts. So people who would walk around the area on a regular basis, and they knew what a street was like. You know, if it had broken windows, if the children had mud on their faces, they knew that it wasn't going to be necessarily that salubrious a place.
Booth found more than 30% of Londoners were living in poverty at the end of the 19th century. The stats have changed since then, and so is the way poverty is measured.
Absolute poverty is the fraction of people who have an income below a given line, a couple of £100 a week, for example. And that line goes up with inflation, but doesn't change other than that. A relative poverty line is a poverty line that changes based on how rich the whole country is. So it's set at 60% of median income, the middle income. And so as the country gets richer, the poverty line goes up, and therefore it's kind of a measure of inequality between middle income and low income people.
The latest official figures suggest that after housing costs, 20% of people in the UK live in absolute poverty, while 22% of people live in relative poverty.
Over the next few years, projections actually show some increases in poverty. That's partly because employment gains, which have happened over the last few years, are expected to kind of peter out, and cuts to working age benefits are really falling upon low-income families with children, and that suppresses their incomes as well.
It was cuts to some benefits that led Ian Duncan-Smith to resign as Work and Pensions Secretary last year. But before that, he changed the way child poverty was measured, the previous Labour government having defined a child as being poor when it lives in a household with an income below 60% of the UK's average.
My problem all along with the 60% line was it only told me one thing, which is you're below it or you're above it. It didn't tell me anything else about what you were about. So what I was trying to do was to say, look, this is something where we need now to work. What are the measurements going to be? Educational failure, family breakdown, dysfunctional family, that kind of stuff. Not, you know, all these things. Find really good statutory measurements for them. Then we begin to have a framework for saying, right, now we know what we have to do to get that family sorted and moving out. And that's the key bit, moving out.
Dealing with the causes of poverty, then, may be more complicated than measuring it. And even the Victorians realised there's more to it than just income.
John Bird, what does living in poverty in Britain in 2017 look like to you?
To me, it looks like people who are stuck on a very, very small amount of money, who are not being able to take advantage of some of the things like democracy. Poverty, if you're in poverty, you're not in democracy, because democracy doesn't cover poverty.
So you're marginalised in every way.
I mean, you're not involved in the debate, largely because you are, in some senses, worn down, eroded by what is happening in life. You're living a stopgap life. You're living a life where there is very little future and there's very little opportunity. Your children are not preparing for higher education or further education. So what happens is that you are stuck, and it seems that all the cards are stacked against you, which they are. Right.
And is the way out of that trap, as it seems, the way you've described, is money the answer?
Money is the answer, but it's not necessarily just dump a couple of £1,000 a week on people. We've got to go back. What we've got is we've got a failing system of government, which is largely responsible for this almost institutional poverty. We fail, if you look at the way that we respond to children and families in need, and children who are in abuse, we take them out, we put them into care, we spend thousands of pounds, maybe £2,000 or £3,000 a week on them. We spend £1 million on them.
And you put them back in that
and
failing
then
home.
At the age of 16, they come out with the average reading age of a 12-year-old. You have a school system which fails 37% of the children.
Even though there have been improvements and there are more children in our schools.
Yeah, unfortunately, these are not my figures. These are Justine Greening's figures about the failure of the school. I thought it was 30. She said it's 37. So, but the point is, if you have a mechanism, if you have a government that cannot respond to that, that uses social security not as social opportunity.
So tax credits, for instance, were you a fan of those, which Gordon Brown always believed were a help to families who were just about managing, maybe not able to keep their heads above water without the state intervening on their behalf on a regular basis? I'm a great believer in using social security for social opportunity. I don't think there's enough given to get people out of the quagmire of poverty, lack of education, lack of it's, you know, if you go back to the school, the failing 37%, they're the people who fill up our prisons. They're the people who fill up our long-term unemployed. They're the people who fill up the A&E department, who use the A&E department as a drop-in. How helpful, though, is the measure of poverty? These two measures, absolute poverty and relative poverty. I mean, the figures are quite stark, 22% living in relative poverty. But is that, as the contributor said in the film, more about inequality, as parts of the population get richer, then those at the bottom look even poorer than they really are? Is it a helpful measure? I'm not too happy on the way people measure poverty. I think that the way you measure poverty is you measure it on the basis of the individual. What can the individual do in their lives to change their lives, to feed their children, to improve their children? And I don't think any of the devices that have been used, even General Booth's back then, were very, very broad brush. I think we tend to reduce people to statistics, and what we should be doing is not creating all these kind of ghettos like we did at Grenville Tower, pushing people into social security rather than using it as an opportunity, a way of getting out of poverty. It was invented for that purpose alone. So we get this really, really weird world that a lot of the poverty could be changed if the government changed the way in which it dealt with people in need and built them so that they can get out of need, and instead of being rescued, they themselves can become rescuers. Let's leave it there.